Imagine you're 9 years old, you wake up to find your mother's lifeless body covering yours. There's blood everywhere. You know that you led to her death. A moment like this does more than just scar you. It rewires every circuit within your brain. The 17th of June should have been an ordinary rainy day. Instead, it became the day that Ichigo Kurosaki learned that wanting to save people gets them killed. The hollow Grand Fisher used the image of a little girl as bait. The young Ichigo, unable to distinguish between ghosts and the living, ran towards what he thought was someone in danger. Masaki chased after him, and she died protecting him from a hollow, not from a car accident or an illness, but from a hollow, the very thing that would later emerge from within Ichigo himself. Ichigo blamed himself immediately and completely for the death of his mother. Early in Bleach, when Ichigo faces off against the Grand Fisher with his newly acquired substitute Shinigami powers, he ends up failing and letting the hollow go. At the grave of his mother, he apologizes for being unable to avenge her. His father tells him that nobody blames him, that Masaki would be angry if she heard him taking responsibility for her death. But unfortunately, traumatic responses don't respond to logic. Trauma stamps itself into your nervous system and it creates its own rules. Ichigo believed, I am responsible when people die. Hollows killed my mother. Therefore, anything hollow related is fundamentally connected to my greatest failure. Fast forward to the Arrancar arc, where Ichigo discovers that he has a hollow living inside of him. He perceives this to be a psychotic inversion of himself that embodies everything that destroyed his family. It's the same type of creature that turned his childhood into a nightmare. As a character who values protecting others, how does he deal with the fact that he carries a power within himself that destroyed the person that he loves the most? Carl Jung would have had a field day analyzing Ichigo because his inner hollow is a textbook definition of the shadow archetype. Jung described the shadow as everything that we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves, our repressed instincts, our capacity for violence, our raw animal nature. The shadow archetype is not evil, it's just everything civilization taught us to lock away. Within Bleach, White embodies pure instinct. This is survival at any cost. It's the willingness to rip enemies apart without hesitation or mercy. The shadow archetype has no moral framework, no second guessing. Its primal drive is to dominate and devour. White terrifies Ichigo because he's built his entire identity around being the protector, someone who is rational, controlled, and fights for the sake of others rather than for bloodlust. White represents everything Ichigo cannot afford to be if he wants to keep his self-image intact. This is why Ichigo reacts the way that he does when he sees that Orihime is afraid of the hollow mask that he is donning. She associates this with the hollification of her older brother. When he's battling against Grimmjow, he is unable to fight at his full potential because of the fear that Orihime feels. Ichigo is only able to take out Grimmjow after Orihime accepts that Ichigo is fighting and struggling not for his own sake but for others. This is where she tells him not to die. Kubo's writing with Ichigo and Hollow Ichigo is brilliant. White isn't corrupting Ichigo. He's the manifestation of Ichigo's natural instinct trying to keep him alive. When a beast senses danger, instincts kick in automatically. White emerges whenever Ichigo's conscious mind can't handle the threat level. We saw this for the first time against Byakuya when his bones were shattering, against Ukiura when his chest had a hole blown through it. Every takeover that looked like possession was actually White preventing Ichigo from dying. Carl Jung argued that refusing to integrate your shadow makes you incomplete. You project your darkness onto others, and you make terrible decisions because you're operating with only half of your personality available. Ichigo spent the Arrancar arc fighting against himself, trying to subjugate and control White through pure dominance. The Visor training taught him to beat his inner hollow into submission rather than accepting it as a part of himself. This is not integration, it's an internal warfare that was going on. The king and the horse metaphor crystallizes this perfectly. White asks, when two beings are equal in form, ability, and power, what determines which becomes the king who leads and which becomes the horse that lends strength? White's answer to this is instinct. It's not moral superiority or rationality, it is that raw, unfiltered killer instinct. White was offering Ichigo partnership, but Ichigo heard it as a threat because accepting that offer meant acknowledging the predator that lives within him. People often misunderstand what scared Ichigo about his hollow power. It wasn't the strength that it possessed, it was the complete absence of his consciousness when that strength manifested. The Vastor Lorde transformation against Ulquiorra represents this nightmare becoming a reality. You're fighting to protect someone that you care about, you end up failing and die, and then the next thing you know, you wake up and discover that your body moved without you. It fought with savage efficiency and it nearly killed one of your closest friends. You have no memory of what had happened and no control over the takeover, just second-hand accounts of yourself acting like a mindless beast, unable to distinguish from friend or foe. Uryu had to intervene to stop Ichigo after he had already basically defeated Ulquiorra, and this was before Ulquiorra severed one of those horns, thus breaking the Vastor Lorde transformation. This was proof to Ichigo that White could replace him entirely. Those markings on Ichigo's hollow mask tell the whole story. When Ichigo first started using his hollow mask, with the Vizards, red stripes appeared and they multiplied across it. This was evidence of his growing acceptance and integration of these hollow powers. Against Grimmjow, the markings expanded significantly. More red meant more control, more conscious access to that strength, but then Ulquiorra happened. After the Vasto Lorde incident, Ichigo's mask changed dramatically. The intricate red patterns disappeared. Instead, we get two perfect black vertical stripes which replaced them. They were symmetrical and rigid, and fans thought that this was an upgrade, but in fact it was regression. Those black bars represented psychological barriers that Ichigo erected to keep himself separated from his hollow nature. He became so terrified of losing control again that he handicapped his own powers, creating a mental block preventing proper hollowification. Those two black stripes are like prison bars, keeping his inner hollow away from him. Tensa Zangetsu confirmed this explicitly when Ichigo entered his inner world to learn the final Getsuga Tensho. He pulled out what Ichigo feared the most, and this was his inner hollow wearing that horned Vastor Lorde mask. This is the form you fear, Zangetsu said, because your mind gets suppressed by your destructive impulses. You've become incapable of properly hollowifying. Ichigo begins realizing that the fear of his inner hollow is a major limitation for him to overcome. White's origin adds new layers to Ichigo's fear that he experiences. White stems from an artificial hollow that had bitten Masaki, initiating her hollowification before she could be saved thanks to Urahara's modified Gigai. When Ichigo was born, White's essence transferred from Masaki to Ichigo, fusing with the Shinigami powers that he inherited from Isshin. The hollow inside of him is directly connected to his mother's death. It's the reason why she was powerless and unable to fight back against the Grand Fisher. When White entered Masaki's soul, she began falling into that dark, lonely abyss during hollowification. She described not being scared because she knew someone down there needed her. That someone was White, who was isolated and alone, operating purely on instinct with no understanding beyond survival. Masaki saved White from that loneliness. The Gigai that bound Isshin's soul to both Masaki and White created a reishi connection linking all three of them, meaning White potentially experienced Masaki's emotions, her joy, her warmth, and her love for her family. For a being who had only known instinct and isolation, suddenly experiencing human connection through Masaki would have been transformative. White had a front row seat to Masaki's love for Ichigo, her protection of him, and her death saving his life. When White tells Ichigo, "I want to protect you," during the fake Karakura Town arc, when he intervenes repeatedly to save Ichigo's life during the course of Bleach, he's honoring the woman who saved him from eternal loneliness. Masaki protected Ichigo with her life. White inherited that role. Ichigo didn't know any of this during the Arrancar arc. All he knew was that a hollow killed his mother, and now he's got one wearing his face, mocking his weakness, threatening to take over whenever he shows vulnerability. The thing that Ichigo feared the most was trying to protect him the entire time, carrying forward his mother's love through methods that looked like violence. When Ichigo trained with the Vizards, their methodology was fundamentally flawed for Ichigo's specific situation. Shinji and the others taught taught him to suppress and control a hollow. This is reasonable advice for Vizards who underwent actual hollowification and needed to manage a foreign corruption. But White wasn't a hollow that infected Ichigo after he was born. White was born with Ichigo and is his Zanpakuto spirit. Trying to subjugate his inner hollow created a hostile relationship where one side must dominate over the other. Every time Ichigo donned that mask, it was an act of forcing White into temporary compliance rather than genuine cooperation. The time limits on his mask weren't about White being weak, they were about Ichigo's psychological resistance. His own mind sabotaged access to his powers because he was terrified of losing control. Compare this to what happens when Ichigo accepts both White and Old Man Zangetsu during the 1000-year Blood War arc. He ends up having his Zanpakuto reforged and it manifests as dual blades. The larger one incorporating his Hollow and Shinigami powers and the shorter one incorporating his Quincy powers. There are no time limits here or internal struggles, no constant fear of White seizing control. The Horn of Salvation form demonstrates this perfectly. It incorporates Ichigo's Hollow powers with that horn and the blackened eye while Ichigo remains fully conscious and in control. This transformation required Ichigo acknowledging a brutal truth that his capacity for violence isn't separate from his capacity for protection. They are the same instinct viewed through different lenses. White's killer instinct and Ichigo's desire to protect both stem from refusing to accept death or defeat. The difference is that Ichigo adds a bit of moral context while White embodies the raw drive and instinctive nature. Jung wrote that integrating your shadow doesn't mean becoming your shadow, it means acknowledging those dark impulses that exist within you, accepting them as a part of your complete self, and consciously choosing how to express them. Ichigo fighting to protect becomes exponentially more effective when backed by White's instinct to dominate and destroy threats, but that only works if Ichigo stops treating White as an enemy. The King and the Horse speech says so much about White's relationship with Ichigo. White wants Ichigo to be king. He calls him king mockingly during their fights, but he means it. The horse's job is lending strength to the king, but White refuses to serve a king who'll lead them both to death through hesitation. White says, "If you're weaker than me, I'll crush you and become king myself." This creates an insane amount of pressure. Ichigo must prove worthy of his own power by the standards of the source of his power. He can't just be strong enough to win fights, he needs the instinct to want to win without reservation. He needs to embrace the parts of himself that enjoy combat, that feel satisfaction in dominating opponents. However, Ichigo's moral framework is built on controlled, justified force. He refuses to fight seriously against enemies that he doesn't respect. He holds back constantly because fighting full force feels excessive or unfair. He talks to enemies mid-battle, trying to understand their motivations. While all of these are virtues in a moral framework, they are in fact weaknesses when you're in a survival situation against opponents like Ulquiorra, who has no interest in Ichigo's principles. The Arancas that Ichigo is facing off against are evolved hollows. They truly embody that instinctive desire to dominate. So White's teachings, they may be harsh, but they are exactly what Ichigo needs to hear. He destroys Ichigo's sword, stabs him through the stomach, verbally demolishes his entire fighting philosophy, telling him you fight with your head instead of instinct. You're trying to cut them with a sheathed sword. He forces Ichigo to confront his weakness by embodying every predator instinct that Ichigo is suppressing. When Kinpachi's manifestation tells Ichigo that warriors born with desire to fight will always seek battle, that's how they gain power, this revelation allows Ichigo to access his killer instinct just enough to stab White and earn temporary recognition. But temporary is the key word. White's warning before leaving says everything. If you want to control my power until our next meeting, make sure you don't get killed. He doesn't say don't let your guard down or stay strong, he says don't die. Because if his inner hollow genuinely wanted to take over permanently, then Ichigo dying would have been perfect for him. There'd be no consciousness to resist against White, but White tells him to stay alive. The threat to take over is the stick White uses to prevent Ichigo from being complacent. His actual goal remains to keep Ichigo alive and to protect him. The resolution to this internal conflict occurs in the Royal Palace when Nimaiya reveals the truth to Ichigo, that his inner hollow is Zangetsu, and it always was. Old Man Zangetsu, the mentor figure that all of us trusted, was suppressing Ichigo's true powers because he represented Ichigo's Quincy powers, and because he inherits the instincts of Yhwach, he had a desire to protect Ichigo by preventing him from walking down the path of a Shinigami. When Ichigo touches his Asauchi, it turns completely white with a hollow masked face. When Nimaiya asks if it's strange that his Asauchi resembles the hollow within him, the foundations of Ichigo's worldview cracks. Every time he called upon Zangetsu's power, he was calling upon White. Every training session, battle, every moment of growth, it was all White teaching him, protecting him and pushing him to be strong enough to survive. White's bow, after Ichigo demonstrates true self-understanding, resolves the king and the horse dynamic completely. Ichigo is no longer a king riding a rebellious horse. The king and the horse merged into one being. White bows not out of subjugation, but out of recognition. Ichigo finally understood the truth that White had been trying to convey from the beginning. The blade is me means accepting that his Zanpakuto's nature is his nature. The violence and the protection are both within him. The instinct and the moral framework are both him. This integration manifests as Ichigo's reforged Zanpakuto, those dual blades representing his different aspects of power working together rather than fighting for dominance. There are no more fears of transformation. The Horn of Salvation form demonstrates that Ichigo can access that Vastor Lorde level of power while remaining completely conscious because he's no longer fighting against himself. The fear that Ichigo had about his hollow power was never really about White. It was about Ichigo's refusal to accept that protection sometimes requires becoming the monster that he fears the most. That his mother's death wasn't his fault, it was instead a tragedy that he couldn't have prevented at just the age of 9. The truth is that the inner hollow within him wasn't trying to replace him or take over, but instead it was trying to keep the promise Masaki made when she gave her life, ensuring Ichigo survives no matter the cost. White inherited Masaki's will, but at the same time, White wore the face of Ichigo's trauma. He embodied every aspect of the hollow that killed Masaki. He represented Ichigo's deepest fear that he might hurt the people that he's trying to protect, and through it all, White was the manifestation of his mother's love, twisted into instinct and violence, but fundamentally aimed at one purpose, which was to protect Ichigo, to keep him alive long enough to become worthy of Masaki's sacrifice. Ichigo wasn't afraid of power or violence, but it was the terrifying possibility that accepting his inner hollow meant accepting that he was never separate from it, that the capacity for mindless destruction and the drive to protect both originate from the same desperate primal need to refuse death. In order for Ichigo to integrate the truth in the 1000-year Blood War arc, it meant that he had to acknowledge parts of himself that he'd spent his entire life, ever since the age of 9, trying to suppress. So yeah, this is my explanation of why Ichigo was afraid of his hollow powers. If there's anything that I've forgotten to mention about Ichigo and his inner hollow, then let me know by continuing the discussion in the comments. I'd love to know your thoughts about the parallels between Kubo's writing and Carl Jung's psychology. But for now, thanks for making it to the end of this video, and I look forward to seeing you in my next one.
A massive thank you goes out to all of my amazing Patreon supporters for helping to make this video possible. If you also want to support the channel and see your name in the end of my videos, then check out my Patreon, which has loads of perks like early video access and so much more. Thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.